There's that famous picture of like the Italian prime minister they kidnapped holding a newspaper. I'm gonna Photoshop Nick Saban's head onto that, and at the top it's gonna say "Roll Tide," and in the newspaper it's gonna be like Bama defeats Tennessee for the 20th time in a row.
Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland, 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 Dixieland.
All right, y'all. Thank you for tuning in to Dixieland the Proletariat. We're going to talk about Southern working class history and current events from a leftist perspective. Make sure to like us on social media at Dixieland of the Proletariat, or find all of our links at our link tree at linktree/.prol. It's DOT-PROL, where if you want to give your wages to a bunch of rednecks, you'll find a link to our Patreon. We got some cool stuff to give you, including CDs, stickers, a cookbook, Discord server, and exclusive episodes. We also have a Spotify playlist with some great artists you also check out, as well as our merch store. This podcast is brought to you by contractional monogamy, not being able to afford therapy, living at home, beta blockers, Kaiser pushing white men in the swamps, Nelson's love life, Tyler's testosterone levels, Mark's laughter, which brings joys. I forgot about the Tyler one. Mark's laughter, which brings joys to the masses, the Alabama Department of Corrections, in the Dade County Iron and Coal Company. Shout out to our new Patreon subscribers, Lulu, Justin, and Will. Our intro music is by Psychotic Refuge. Our producer is Mr. Speaker. Our monthly Patreon surplus goes to groups that are run by and or help marginalized people directly. As always, I'm Nelson with...
And I'm staring down the barrel of a hurricane.
Why is it Tyler's testosterone levels and not mine?
Homophobic, Nelson.
Oh, God damn it. And our guest this evening is...
Hey y'all, my name is Alex. On the Not Southern Marxist Instagram account, I'm also an editor at Midwestern Marx and a history teacher.
Yay! Next is Eddie. We got to get Eddie on.
I'll talk to him.
He's like, who the fuck are these guys? All right. So, in tradition of pissing off that one fan that gets mad that we talk about shit before the actual episode starts, and I know because I'm going to get shitted on by Tyler when he comes back. Italy has regressed 70 years and has elected a fascist party into power again.
Yeah, but it's run by a lady. So
No,
it's cool now.
yes.
Glass
Girl
ceiling
boss.
shattered.
Fucking gaslight, gatekeep, girl pause, fascism. Oh my God. And that's like, the thing is, it's like, it's not like, you know how, like, we all have the tendency of like calling everything fascism, right, that we just don't like, but like when you're literally the direct descendants of like Italy's social fascist movement, right, that part, Benito Mussolini's party, you can't really get around the fact that y'all are fascists. Like the party is one, like the coalition is 100% fascist. Like you can't get around that. So it's just like,
All right, Nelson, you have to now. I'm not going to shit on you, but
pizza.
you are going to have to answer for all of Italy.
I'm gonna have to
If I have to
answer
answer for all Indians, you have to answer for all of Italy.
There's a gas station in northern Italy that's missing its fascists. That's all I have to say. And when you see the world when they finally see the world for how it is upside down, that'll be the day where we can celebrate. But yeah, oh my God, I was just like, you gotta be you stupid fucking guineas. Like, why you had that bald-headed fucked up the country one time, and you fucking killed him, and now you had to do it again. Why? And literally like 100 years after, it's like, why are you doing this?
Unfortunately, we had that. After they strung up Mussolini, had 30, 40 years today of U.S. interference in their elections and stuff immediately after.
Fucking
giving money to
Gladio.
like the Christian Democrats, and obviously Operation Gladio and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, a whole lot of U.S. fucking around.
The years of lead was fucking great. Fucking everyone just blowing shit up, and they kidnapped the prime minister. and it's just like Roll Tide. But like
time-honored tradition.
time-honored Italian tradition. Hey, we kidnapped a prime minister, and he's gonna disappear.
Little did they know that the Red Brigades were referring to Roll Tide.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But now on, every time I say Roll Tide, I'm referring to what Baguette de Rosa. Yeah, that's what I'm referring to now. The Red Brigades.
Okay, Nelson, I need you to buy a Roll Tide t-shirt in red, and then when I see you in a couple of weeks, we'll get some craft supplies, and we'll make sure that we'll add the other phrase on there just for you.
Get some puffy paint.
Oh my God.
I want to be glittery like you're decorating a t-shirt for cheer camp.
Wait, I'm going to get that picture. There's that famous picture of like the Italian prime minister they kidnapped holding a newspaper. I'm going to Photoshop Nick Saban's head onto that. And at the top it's going to say Roll Tide. And in the newspaper, it's going to be like Bama defeats Tennessee for the 20th time in a row.
Episodes always start out spicy.
Exactly. But yeah, so Italy is backsliding. And then, you know what's funny is that, like, you know, something's wrong when like Poland and Hungary are like, oh, this is awesome.
God.
It's like literally, it was like, yeah, Poland and Hungary both congratulated Italy's new
it's
ruling party.
Facebook status. Poland and Hungary.
And then fucking Spain and France, Macron of all people is like, this is not good.
We will have a strong talk with them when you get to European Parliament.
You have to understand. We'll give you. These are not the Algiers. You cannot do this to your own people.
Oh man, just as fucked up as this all is, I just want everybody to like keep your eyes on Italy, because Italy has a huge amount of migrants leaving Africa that cross Mediterranean and routinely die in the Mediterranean, and the few that make it to Italy, they get there and they have no help already, and now it's gonna get worse. So just like keep your eyes on that shit.
And you know, Mussolini 2.0 wants to fucking like use the Italian Navy to blockade North African countries so like migrants can't get over. It's just like how do you like colonize these countries, and then you're like, why do they want to come here? It's like maybe like the Libyans and the Somalians and the like Ethiopia's pissed because you invaded twice. Like maybe they're just, you know, tired of this shit and they're like, let's just go to Italy. It sounds nice.
Yeah, it's like when the U.S. overthrows governments in Latin and South America, and then they're like, "What are all these people come here for? What are all these Haitians here for?" Like
the best is the funniest one to me is France, when they're like, why are these Muslims coming to France? And it's just like, you literally colonized these fucking countries. You made them French citizens, and now they're coming over. They don't even have to exchange their money. Oh, they have to exchange it from francs to euro. My bad. But like, they're fucking citizens. Like, what did you expect was gonna happen?
Yeah, don't downgrade the euro, Nelson.
I'm sorry.
We already had a traumatic breakup, okay?
Oh my God. Oh, speaking of which, I want to see how Liz Truss, Prime Minister, reacts to I want to see if she gets along with, I don't even know. I'm not even gonna dignify looking up the new Prime Minister of Italy's name. I wonder if they're gonna be friends. Do you think they're gonna be friends and have like
a couple of girl bosses hanging out together?
Have sleepovers.
This is the starting of an MLM right now.
Ooh, the two Liz Truss, Maloney, and Marine Le Pen.
Oh God!
Could you imagine? Could you imagine that hell like that fucking like brunch would be?
that like, okay, you want to talk about Mean Girls? That is going to be the ultimate Mean Girls.
Holy shit, that's the new Mean Girls. Someone should get
on
that
Wednesdays.
movie.
We oppress people that we formerly colonized.
Who would be the fourth though? Someone would have to be the fourth.
Oh shit! Oh,
Hillary Clinton comes in. You're not president.
She's a Katie.
You lost the election.
She's from out of town. She turns into a mean girl.
You lost the election. You can't sit with us. Oh my God. Oh.
Anyone who tries to use their feminism to talk about how this is actually good, fuck you. I say this as the resident fire-breathing feminist on this show.
Yeah,
God.
I just saw a Politico headline saying like when Maloney first went to her first like far right fascist meeting when she was younger. All the men looked at her sideways, something like that. Now she's their prime minister.
Yeah,
I think y'all are missing the point. Y'all are missing the problem here. Like
it's like when they're like, Margaret Thatcher shattered the glass ceiling. Yeah, and then she took shards and like stabbed other women in the face with it.
She really did. She fucking hated women.
She's just like filed it down to a fucking shiv and just like stabbing all the other women with the shattered glass ceiling. Oh my god. Oh yeah. And then I made that meme with Marcos's wife. I can't remember what her name was. The first lady.
Melda.
Melda. When she had all the shoes, she like robbed the treasury for the shoes. She's like, I have all these shoes and human rights violations. Anyway,
The world's saddest Yas queen. Slay.
Not literally, please stop. Please.
Fucking slay.
We're already bleeding.
Alex, this is our professional podcast. Just want to let you know we are professionals.
I already told Nelson, please don't expect any intelligent answers from me today because I'm in my parents' house waiting for a hurricane to come. There are no brain cells left. This is being hugely like we're so professional and good at our jobs.
We are. And then we have the new co-host, your stuffed manatee behind.
Yes, I have a stuffed man. I have a stuffed manatee behind me and a stuffed possum behind me, and I'm holding a stuffed raccoon. So,
Mark, what do you have in arm reach?
I have.
Is it bones?
I could. I got a shark's jaw over there, and then I have like a taxidermy duckling over here.
I'm just ready to like turn on, like, to start the episode one day and you have that fucking cow head, that cow skull on somehow.
I have a gator tooth from a gator that my uncle shot. Can I be part of Bone Club?
Bone Club.
Bone Club. I don't have any.
You're not allowed.
I know. I don't have any bones.
That's a personal problem.
I know, right? I'm just a pool of flesh.
No. No structure.
I have in my grass I have a fiery chipotle gourmets. This shit's great. Okay.
Why isn't it in your refrigerator?
Has there ever been a moment when you are more spicy white? Oh
I know,
my
right?
god, you literally have spicy mayonnaise next to you.
This is great. It's like when your family, when you're white, but your family's from Southern Europe.
Good
I also have
mayo.
Yeah. I also have my Tony Soprano, Saint Tony Soprano coffee mug. Yeah. Anyway, so now that we've thoroughly pissed off that, I wonder if he still listens.
Probably not. You're probably just like letting him live rent free in your mind.
I know, right?
And just
well, now
enshrining him in this podcast forever. His memory will live on.
We have a justifiable reason to just bullshit before the episode. Oh man.
I think we've had worse people on here whose episodes have stayed up.
Yeah. Alex, the bar is really low. I just want to let you know. You can make all this shit up and it would still be probably a better episode than some of the stuff we've had.
Resounding endorsement for the podcast.
Yeah. So Alex is here and you're going to talk to us about the history of convict leasing, correct?
Yes.
Awesome. This is something that we've probably mentioned like in passing a bit on the show. Maybe I think I might have touched on it on our Sharecroppers Union episode, but it's something that I studied a bit in my Southern politics class, but it's not something that like I'm extremely familiar on. So I'm glad you're on here to talk about this because it's still very relevant today. So Alex, this is your platform. Deal with it as you wish. Like I said, you can make up all this shit and it wouldn't matter.
So starting my fairy tale now. Okay. So now this is actually all completely real, which is more disturbing. But so following the Civil War, I might as well just go and define what we're actually going to be talking about. So following the Civil War, basically in the South, obviously after the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment and all that, the institution of slavery was officially abolished. But as we all know, that was more, I guess, formal than actually carried. Of convict leasing was basically a way of rounding up poor black people in the South en masse to basically be rounded up as like convicts and sent to leased out to private companies to work for them, essentially as forced labor. So mainly we're going to be talking about that. So basically starting from the end of the Civil War to the early 20th century when the convict lease was replaced by the chain gang, which we'll also talk a little bit about. But they're kind of the same thing, just structured a little bit different, and who actually had control of them is a little bit different. But they're still like kind of all in the same sort of way of like kind of maintaining coerced labor even following the abolition of slavery in the South. So first, really get into that history though, we kind of have to tackle this like false dichotomy that has kind of arisen between like capitalist free labor and the old South agrarian system, because that's not very accurate. As I'm sure we all, for the war, plenty northern industrialists still took a lot of supplies and raw materials from the South. So not only was there connections there, but also just following the war, a lot of northern or Yankee still came down and pretty happily participated in the forced labor that happened with convict leasing and the chain gang. Although that's not really what it's about. It's still more about the South. I just want to make that point.
It's always good to talk about the Yankee Devil.
True. The carpetbaggers aren't that much better. I think one of the things about being a Southerner, being a Southern communist, is like, yeah, okay, South kind of sucks, but North doesn't really have room to talk because they're also full of shit. Like, so it's kind of the same thing. There's kind of like this false dichotomy, and something that Marx even kind of talks about in his writings in the Civil War is that essentially the way it's framed is that like basically the way or the systems of using bonded labor and free labor are different. That capitalism basically presupposes capitalism and industrialism presuppose having free labor in your area, while something like that was kind of more of a feudal system in the South was still like dependent on bonded labor. True, as like the book I'm mainly drawing from is called Twice the Work of Free Labor, the political economy of convict labor in the New South by Alex Lichtenstein. That's the main book I'm drawing from, and he generally argues that it's better to like, instead of like drawing like a sort of like opposing sides between like the Redeemers who basically battle Reconstruction and like Republican governments, instead of like treating them as like two necessarily opposing sides, is that they're kind of a place where they kind of came together on and both supported, because it not only created like the bonded and cheap labor that was necessary for industrializing things like coal mines and stuff like that, and like either coal or railroads, and also it was also a form of labor discipline for Southern agricultural landowners. So it's kind of like convict lease wasn't some sort of like just like a continuation of slavery, but it was kind of like and I guess an industrial form of it as well, which was also, that's not even to say that that before the Civil War that like enslaved people were only used for agricultural purposes, also kind of incorrect, because as we know, especially enslaved people did get kind of like pushed more towards doing industrial labor, particularly as like the manpower was more and more needed in industrial areas. So yeah, those I think that's just kind of like the main thing we need to like sort of from the get-go, is that there's not really some sort of like dichotomy between the two, that they kind of can go together. So yeah, first I think a good thing for us to start with is not just like, so we got kind of have out of the way with sharecroppers and tenant farmers, because that's kind of like the key background to this. So basically tenant farmers, so following the abolition of slavery, Black people were generally kept as like agricultural laborers through cropping. So basically it was where the old plantations and old estates that they used to work on were essentially divided up in a sort of a feudal manner, and each like little plots of land were essentially rented out to sharecroppers usually. The main difference is that tenant farmers usually just pay their rent directly, either in cash or some sort of payment, while sharecroppers normally paid their rent in kind, so they would give back part of the the crops if they were growing cotton, up to where it's like a third of the crop just goes directly to the landlord, and then they could do what they wanted with it. Depends. And as we all know, kind of similar to like mining towns later on. A lot of these places by using like putting people in debt. So most of these tenant farmers, sharecroppers were generally like poor, not very well off people, and they were not really able to afford the implements that were needed to farm. Sometimes they had to take it on credit from their landlords, and also kind of like I said, similar to like mining towns later on in Appalachia, you have like also something called the plantation store, where pretty much the only place where people like lived on those plantations could go to get food or other materials they need at the plantation store, which was owned by the landlord, and essentially made it to where these people were usually in debt. So it was, sharecropping and tenant farming also often veered into areas of debt peonage, where people were essentially like attacked that they worked, like they could not escape because they were perennially in debt.
And that was a big thing we talked about real quick in our episode on the Sharecroppers Union and the book Hammer and Hoe and the Alabama Sharecroppers Union.
STFU.
Yeah, we talked about STFU, but then we also talked about the Communist Party in Alabama and the Sharecroppers Union. So in the book Hammer and Hoe, and that was a big sticking point, was that plantation store. It was like a lot of the times they wanted to be able to get paid in cash, and they wanted to be able to go to other places to buy stuff, and they wanted to be able to travel more, and they wanted to be able to sell their stuff that they raised at a higher market, like a better market value, when a lot of times they were getting fucked over by the white society and the white people that own the actual stores and the places where the markets where you'd sell the cotton and whatnot. So yeah, no, that I think our longtime listeners will remember all of that from that episode if they listen to it. But yeah, that was a major sticking point with those stores, and they really are like the old company stores in mining towns. It really is just modern feudalism. It's you had the plantation owner, the former plantation owner, as the feudal lord, and then the sharecroppers and the tenant farmers would basically be indebted to the new age feudal lord. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and something we're gonna get into is not only did like a lot of the old plantation owners maintain their plantations and the lands that they had, but also a lot of the companies we're going to be talking about that got into mining. A lot of those guys were also in the antebellum period, so they were So there was not a whole lot of changeover from before the Civil War to after the Civil War. A lot of the same sort of people, same group there. So naturally, along with sharecroppers and tenant farmers, well, being enslaved for hundreds of years, Black people were generally pretty eager to get out of their former situation. So basically, convict leasing emerged, and we all know about like Black codes and stuff. War. These emerged as ways to essentially control recalcitrant Black labor that would otherwise be trying to move around or be trying to like actually seek out some form of freedom or being able to like make some sort of life for themselves. So Black code convict leasing essentially arose to discipline that, because not only did Southern planters still need Black people as agricultural laborers, but the same thing for poor people in general. They needed poor people to work as agricultural laborers, but also now the South is also trying to shift into basically what we'd call now the New South, which is also part of that false dichotomy I'm talking about. There's not really an Old South, the New South divide, but basically trying to shift towards a post-war South of kind of like shifting towards industrializing with mining businesses and building railroads. So a big thing is railroads. That's a huge part of this, and basically trying to set up transportation, because all of this is essentially designed around not only providing labor to these companies, but also in the roads that are necessary to transport the things that they're extracting. So we're going to talk a lot about like coal and iron ore and that sort of stuff, and how that was like railroads were built to like kind of move those around. So yeah, convict leasing is basically a system. Black people were arrested for very like, or in some cases poor Southern white people as well, but not nearly in the same numbers. It's mainly focused on Black people. were arrested for pretty either flimsy pretexts or like petty theft, and were basically put in jail for long periods of time, and were then leased out to companies to work either in their coal mines or on the railroads. Just maybe much on race. Okay, so just a couple examples I have here. Jim Watkins stole 15 pounds of meat from a Georgia smokehouse in 1887 and received a 15-year sentence, which he served out on doing convict lines. He was eventually pardoned, but that was after he already served his term. Fun times. See, another one is, on the other hand, in 1889, Colonel G.G. Flint was convicted of carrying a concealed weapon. It was sentenced to pay a $50 fine or face a chain. He was pardoned by Governor John Brown Gordon. So he was a white man, of course. So that's why he was pardoned. Great. And there's another example where I believe it was the Georgia government used an old anti-claim passed during Reconstruction that was basically it was passed to prevent people from mobs from lynching, planning to kill black people, from lynching black people. And guess what they did? They used it to arrest black people to convict labor. So there's one example. I'm not sure what page it's on. I kind of forgot which page it's on, but they talk about this where a few black men were arrested for conspiring to kill another black man under this old anti-Klan statute and were sent to jail for that. So very straightforward.
I remember
the most honest people.
I remember one of the things we talked about in class, business, I think blew everyone's mind, is that like just being unemployed could get you rounded up and arrested at this point if you were black. It was just like, and then you were put into the convict leasing system, and then you were leased out and like basically sold to any company or any place that needed you. And it's for like loitering, like for being unemployed, for like traveling through the wrong places. It was it's just, this time period is absolutely absurd.
Yeah, you get arrested for vagrancy or being too long without being employed, that sort of stuff. You could easily get arrested for that. And also, and this is just let me like the more official end of convict leasing that we're talking about right now. When we transition to talk about chain gangs, we're going to talk about more of the informal one, which is kind of a bit more scary. So yeah, not a fun story. Basically, the way convict leasing gets started is immediately after the war. Most of the prisoners, most convicts in Georgia were sent to the Milledgeville Penitentiary. That was pretty much the only major prison in the state. Usually, it kind of followed like some basically patterns in the North where people kind of like worked. People still like worked and did like jobs and stuff for like building things, but it was more kind of like trade craft building things, and it was all entirely housed in the penitentiary. What changes is following basically conditions at the Milledgeville prison are very terrible, as you can imagine. It's basically in the South after the Civil War, so things aren't very good there. And they're also not really able to, and I mean the penitentiaries complaining that they don't have enough resources to keep the convicts employed and that sort of stuff. So what the Governor Jenkins at the time, what he does is he assigns a 3-person cabinet to basically make recommendations on what to do with new convicts. 2 of the 3 people, so it's a 3-person committee. 2 of the 3 people on the committee were Howell Cobb and Mark Cooper. Cobb was a defender of the old agrarian order, and Cooper was a prominent industrialist. So one of the things that the committee recommended was the quarry at Stone Mountain, which was connected to the state-owned Western and Atlantic Railroad. So basically, it's a lava lime quarry. It's Stone Mountain. It is and that's the state-owned railroad is able to reach it. The committee also recommended the state focus on, and one of the things that they decided to do was try and shift convict labor to iron production, particularly in the Northwest, which is what we'll talk about Dade County a little bit. So there's like part of Appalachia where like a lot of the coal and stuff is in Northwest Georgia. There's only a small, really as much as there is in like Tennessee or Alabama, but there's still some there, and that's what they're trying to exploit it. So they wanted to shift the iron production, and as would happen, one such company that was involved in this was Etowah Iron Works in Northwest Georgia, which was owned by Cooper. He owned it. Great, nice guy. Cooper later incorporated that iron and mining company as Dade County Iron Company, and it would pass into the hands of Georgia's Civil War Governor Joseph E. Brown, who is another nice.
I do declare.
Yes, Joseph Brown.
Wait, Alex, you're telling me the guy who was on the commission owned a mining company and got like a kickback basically in free labor is what you that's crazy. It's like, I'm so glad that doesn't happen today. You know, I'm so glad that this horrible sort of practice doesn't happen today.
Yeah, I'm really happy that everything's above board today in our modern economy. It's great. Nothing like this ever happens. So yeah, that is one of the things. So, okay, 1 second. Okay, so basically my other point is, well, we can stick on the coal stuff for right now, and then we'll get on to railroads. So a lot of okay, so like a lot of the companies that ended up getting lease agreements after the war were actually owned by former Confederate collaborators. One such case was the company Grant Company. So yeah, it's a little repetitive name, which was leased the entirety of the Milledgeville prison penitentiary population. So all the prisoners that were in the Milledgeville prison were leased to Grant Alexander and Company in 1869. Captain Lemuel P. Grant had directed the wartime use of slaves until 1864. So up until basically the end of the war, the man who was one of the owners of this company was directing use of slaves in industrial production during the Civil War. So, nice guys. They would use the convicts to build the Macon and Brunswick Railroad and a bunch of other railroads. And they're also able, since they released all of these companies, they were able to shift them basically around as they needed. So as they needed production, they were able to move them wherever they. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So beyond working in mines and quarries, convicts were also used to construct rail lines. Yeah. So. Oh, and also one of the big things that to point out is that one of the these rail lines were Republicans. So the Republican government. So Reconstruction government. Yeah. So that's what I'm saying when I was saying there's not really a dichotomy, is that a lot of the convict labor and stuff was still encouraged by Republican, even Reconstruction figures. So
that was actually going to be my next. I was actually going to ask that, like, what did the radical Republicans, the progressive Republicans at the time, quote unquote, think of this? And it's just like, oh, nah, it's cool. It's like slavery's bad. This convict leasing thing is fine as long as we're making money.
Yeah, like, it's not big. So two of the first railroads to use convict labor were Georgia and Alabama Railroad and the Cartersville and Van Wert Railroad, which were granted by General Thomas, who was the general Congress following the Civil War. So after Jenkins, who was the I guess elected, or I think he was the presidential Reconstruction governor, and then Thomas becomes the basically the congressional appointee. And after his successor, Rufus Bullock. It's General Thomas Ruger is his name. He was appointed in the Congressional Reconstruction. His elected Republican successor was Rufus Bullock, and he was an avid promoter of railroads and incredibly corrupt. So super corrupt. I think one of the terms the book uses, like chimerical schemes for the people around him. So basically just like coming up with entirely fake companies and stuff and scamming people. So, very, again, doing great things. So between 1871, 600 miles of new rail were laid, mostly by convict labor. So between those few years, a lot of miles of railroad were laid, and yeah, mainly pretty much all using convicts. And so that's so basically a big thing to point out here is that in both of these cases, the issue that they had was that they just could not get free labor to do what they needed. Essentially, I mean, we kind of know now with the whole COVID thing how there's a labor shortage because they're just not willing to pay people enough. Similar, pretty much the same thing is that these coal companies and railroad companies cannot maintain a consistent supply of free labor because they treated them so shitty and didn't pay them enough. Were awful. So of course people were just like, yeah, I'm not going to do this. So they would have things where people would just show up to just walk off the job and just not come back and that sort of stuff. So they constantly had trouble keeping labor to do the job. So that's where this comes in. shift to convict leasing in order to make up for that. And that's also going to be something we're going to talk about a little bit, is kind of the conflict. One of the downfall for convict leasing was its basically its conflict with free labor, basically like driving, either being used to union bust or driving down wages. And also, racism too, because like a lot of the old unions in the South were not very friendly to Black people either. So those will be all the points that we get into. Like, but for right now, we'll stick with what sticking with. In 1876, the Georgia legislature passed a lease law requiring the governor to farm out, quote unquote, convicts for a period of 20 years, and any convicts sentenced to more than 5 years would be sent to mines. Basically, this was one way that they would keep like long-term labor, is that if you were convicted for a long period of time, you essentially got sent directly to the mines, and you'd pretty much serve out your entire sentence there. So more fun time. The Dade Coal Company, it's something we already talked about, but one of these, so they basically took like consolidated a lot of the convicts in Georgia. So maybe we're talking about Georgia right now. Dade Coal Company, they put like many of those convicts in Northwest Georgia because it was they were able to concentrate a lot of convicts there, and they were like less likely to escape because it was very isolated. Because the constant problem that lessees had was that they constantly had people escaping, and so this was called a Southern Siberia, where people were sent to, and that's if that tells you any indication of how bad conditions were there, it's very bad. So there was very to the economy. I have a little quote here in the book that I wanted to read from. So basically, it just kind of goes over all of this stuff. So what's super important about this is just how pivotal all of these things were to like Southern economies, especially like towards industrialization. That is coal from these mines provided fuel for the state's rapidly expanding railroads, especially the Western Atlantic energy to power the Atlanta Rolling Mill, the city's largest post-mill employer, and other developing industries. And after being cooked in the Dade Coal Company's ovens, stoked Vaughn pig iron furnace in Dade County, as well as the Chattanooga Iron Company's furnace across the river in Tennessee. So basically, a lot of the coal and stuff from these mines would go to either like so one of the things is like pig iron furnaces. That's like where they refine coal and that sort of stuff to make iron, or like so like all these things were kind of like essentially dependent on this coal operation because it would go to like fueling so many things throughout the South. So it's like not only were the railroads basically built by convicts, the coal that would power the railroad, the trains were also mined by convicts. So basically, the entire industrialization post-Civil War is in the South is basically powered by forced Black labor, essentially. So a little bit about Dade, but it's actually even worse in neighboring states. So one of the examples are Alabama and Tennessee, where there are greater levels of coal production and like actual like greater levels of like coal deposits there along the so one of the companies is called Pratt Coal and Coke Company, which was started by Henry F. de Balderleben. I'm not sure. It's in Birmingham. That's his name. It's an interesting name. I like it, honestly. I'm like that's kind of an interesting. But yeah, no, he was an asshole. He basically the entire building of a lot of the industrial growth of Birmingham around that time was based on this company and was based on convict labor. So he was actually known as like probably the most like industrialist in Alabama, and probably became like his main like one of the main reasons why they were able to industrialize well at least Birmingham and other areas in Alabama. So that's just a couple examples of just like how dependent these like how were on forced Black labor still towards even after the Civil War. So one of the big things about convict labor is that it operated on the task system. So basically, I have a little more details about it, or did their labor by task. So instead of you weren't paid by hour, you're paid by like the amount of coal you actually produced. So you're basically paid by the tonnage, or so if you got you sent out 1 ton, you got like sent. And in the cases of free labor, that was actually kind of advantageous for the coal miners because I have a little detail about all of the stuff you're supposed to do that you had to do for this. Let's see. Okay. So basically, miners would like work in like a central mine shaft, which ran to the hillside. The free coal miner, he operated essentially as an independent artisan. Worked his room by like basically he cut the coal, blasting it loose and loading it into a car, which he pushed up the main shaft. And that each miner would attach like an identification number to it, so it could be identified by the owners. And they would be paid by the tonnage. So in addition to this, and in addition to actually just blasting the coal, work do dead work, which is basically clearing debris, timbering, and making sure that your room doesn't cave in. So fun things. And then okay, but what's important is that at least could directly control the pace they worked at because of how far away they were. It was pretty much impossible for supervisors to be sitting there like, doing what they do in factories and be like, oh, I don't know, you're not working fast enough, bro. You need to speed it up. They couldn't do that. That presented a huge problem for mine owners in that, well, now basically what a lot of mine workers had the thing where like, okay, I've mined enough coal for today, so I'm just going to go home. I made enough money, so I don't need to work. A lot of free laborers but a lot of mine owners did not. So what they ended up doing was they switched up to convicts, and they were able to set a quota system similar to how was set in enslaved people. They didn't meet this quota. Guess what happened? They got whipped because that's what they had to. That's what they did. Yeah, so they were required to meet that quota, and basically what happens is if you show that you can meet that quota, they would just increase it. So if you can consistently meet the quota that you're making, and you're like, okay, I'm good, I can do this, no problem, they would just increase the quota, and if you didn't meet it, they would beat you. So, yeah, fun times in great. Okay, so that is the main reasons why they kind of had to switch to more convict laboring, and then so this was also like led to a lot of convicts with free labor, obviously because convicts, because free labor is not very happy about this. So first, they are obviously competing with free labor for work. They're also using them to break strikes. So frequently, when people go on strike, obviously they would just send in convict labor to basically break them. So yeah, also there's like obviously like racial overtones to this because there's also white workers are upset that these convicts, who are largely black, are undermining their wages, and essentially they're trying to argue that they're stealing their jobs. So I mean, there's like, and that leads to a lot of the unions to opposing convict labor, although not necessarily for the right reasons, but they do. So that's like one of the things that like people are fighting back against convict laboring, and then also along with that, the increased cost in coal and increased competition, and also the mechanization of actual like coal use has made it to where essentially. So one of the argument he makes in the book is that the Southern iron and coal companies could not compete because they were using convict labor, and that prevented, because the convict labor was so cheap, that prevented them from from mechanizing essentially, and that was like one of the reasons why they shifted to got rid of convict. Convict leasing does end up going away in 1908, although it's like I'm basically, the point I'm trying to make is it's kind of reported as if like some sort of humanitarian victory, something like that. It's mainly just because it was not as useful for the mine operators anymore, and because like labor was just getting pissed off. So those were the two main reasons, not any sort of like humanitarian reason for it. But those are the main things I had on convict leasing. So that kind of mainly covers the short, because convict leasing pretty much only goes from so immediately after the Civil War. So usually like starting around 1870, it's when the first like convict leasing kind of starts, and then it ends in 1908 years. And I mainly just focus on Georgia here. So do y'all have anything y'all want to add on to this part?
I think like to go back to the to Birmingham, I think people that are not maybe not from the South, but also like not from Alabama, don't realize like how powerful Birmingham was. Like it was like considered the Detroit of the South. Like it was a powerhouse. And the fact that like all that capital and all that money and all that wealth was generated by these convicts, like in the convict leasing system, like the mines in Birmingham were like the power that they wielded was like what you would see in like Pittsburgh, right? With like Carnegie and all those people. So like the mine companies like owned Birmingham. And on top of all of that, you have the state sponsored violence with like black codes and eventually Jim Crow and the Klan, who was adamantly anti-labor, like all coming together to make it just worse. And the power that Birmingham had went all the way into the 1970s when they finally started closing these mines. The EPA came in and started closing the furnaces in the mines and saying like you can't do this anymore. It's just bad. And like that whole from like 100 years almost, by 1870 to like 1970, the amount of power that like this place wielded, like these companies wielded, was just like ridiculous. I think I might have even found someone in Birmingham, one of our friends sent me this, that like Birmingham itself, the coal miners eventually had like an own like little mini Blair Mountain where they like fought back like within the coal wars from like 1870 to like 1930s. They had their own like sort of rebellion. They rebelled against like the mining companies and towns and stuff. Like they called it like a mini Blair Mountain. But the amount of power that these coal companies and iron ore like all this shit, the smelters and everything had in Birmingham was just ridiculous. It's not just like, oh, it's a little tiny mining. No, this was like the equivalent of Pittsburgh. Like it was massive. So I want people to realize that it's not like a handful of convicts are going into one mine. It's like this is a massive. If anyone's ever been to Birmingham, the mountains that surround it, all full of coal at one point. And it's a massive operation. If you ever go to Sloss Furnace for like a music festival, like one of their haunted things they have, or just see pictures of it or watch that Ghost Adventure episode, that was a massive furnace that like literally smelted all the iron ore, like all the coal there to make the steel. Like it's not just a small little rinky dink operation. It is a massive fucking operation. So people need to keep that in mind. And like when we're talking about Birmingham and mining, like I said, it's not some like little rinky dink operation. It is a massive operation.
Yeah, and one of the things to keep in mind is that like just as you were saying is like it's a furnace, right? And there's like all that's not even the mining part. And convicts are probably used in probably every step of that process. So like company used not they had the they had the mining operation in Northwest Georgia, and they had basically contracted with other mine operators to like start like it's like pretty much all the way throughout this entire process. You know, many of these companies had like hundreds of convicts working for them. So like I think the one we brought up about the Grant Alexander Company, which is the one with the former Confederate, they had several hundred convicts working for them at any given time. And they would, like I said, they would kind of like shift them around to whatever projects they needed. Because that was like one of the added advantages is that obviously with free labor is they can up and they don't have to like, if I, all right, y'all are going to be building this railroad in Rome, Georgia, which is in the north. Now all of a sudden I need you to go down here to the south. So I don't know, wherever, don't fucking know where, Southwest Georgia or something. Then obviously free labor is gonna be like, no, just go fuck yourself. Like they're gonna tell me to jump in a lake. I can do if I have convicts, I can basically do whatever I want. So like the main point is just like kind of realizing how much it was just a way of like labor discipline, particularly to make sure black people who were formerly enslaved kind of remain in the same sort of particularly like around. So that's like why I was bringing up earlier how it like it's double advantageous for the industrialists and for planters who basically get benefits of having essentially obviously you don't want to get arrested to get sent to the mines, so you're going to try and be as you're going to like want to try and appease your planter as much as possible, because like things back then you could get like black people could get arrested for little things as little as like petty theft, and all you really need is the sort of like the testimony of a white man to get you sent to jail over that. So it's like this was just a very easy. And one of the essays I was reading about this is that how it did like you could like directly see how between areas where there were like high concentrations of sharecroppers and tenant farmers, and like the highest levels of convict leasing. Is that the highest levels of convict leasing, the chain gang would be in those areas, particularly in the Black Belt, which, if people don't know what the Black Belt is, the Great Migration in the mid 20th century, and I think still today, the majority of Black people lived in like this like basically strip in the South. I think it's starting with like North Carolina, going all the way to
it starts in Virginia and works its way down like the kudzu vine that's slowly strangling on Dixie, all the way out to Texas. Yeah.
Yeah. So so that's what the Black Belt is, and it's kind of like the obviously the areas where there's like greatest concentration of plantations during antebellum. So yeah, that's like, so you can see like a direct correlation between having like high levels of convict leasing and the areas where like the most exploitative forms of labor were being used, and like agricultural labor were being used. So that's particularly to remember, is that this was really just a way to make sure to keep Black people from getting too uppity. Essentially, is the entire thing.
It's a continuation of slavery. Like, it's just basic. It's a continuation. It's like it never went away. It just changed its forms. And I think a really like just disgusting, like nefarious fucking thing is like, oh, you only have a 5-year sentence. We're gonna send you to the coal mines, because like coal mining is dangerous now, but like back then it was almost a death sentence. Yeah. So like you could be arrested for loitering and then thrown into a coal mine and probably die from a various of things, like variety of things that could kill you in a coal mine. And it's just like from being, crushed or exploded or dying of lack of oxygen. Like, it's crazy to think that like, oh, I don't have a job, so I got arrested and now I'm thrown to a coal mine, I'm going to die. Like, it's fucking crazy.
Yeah. Safety conditions were not very good, obviously. So yeah, just going to coal mines would be just in terms of things you're going to be breathing in.
What the hell is this OSHA? We ain't got no damn OSHA around here.
Well, especially in the 1890s, not a whole lot of OSHA regulations going on. So yeah, a lot of people died either from obviously just it's not good for your lungs, or mine collapses, explosions, that sort of stuff. So those were also pretty frequent, and that actually it does end up being, there is like some sort of like moral outrage at it, the fact that this is so dangerous and people are going there. But like I said, that's kind of like was one of the reasons why. I don't think that's the primary reason. But yeah, definitely not very fun to be in any of these coal mines. Okay. Next thing I had was about chain gangs. So we're kind of shifting here to more fun gangs. So convict leasing is abolished in Georgia, at least in 1908. It does continue in other states. So I think in Florida and Alabama, I think of the two, it still like continues until the 1920s. Before it's ended to convict leasing. So basically the main difference between convict leasing and chain gang is that the convict leasing convicts were essentially directly were essentially completely given over to work. So they were like, the private interests were supposed to house them, feed them, clothe them, everything. They're supposed to do all of the taking care of them, and they're pretty much entirely under their control. The chain gang is actually kind of a shift towards at least being entirely under state control. It's not necessarily that much better, because still kind of similar conditions continue on there. Okay, so one of the main things that so it's important to know is that that chain gang is actually an aggressive thing. So at the time, it was considered like a humanitarian intervention.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Wait, what?
It was part of the progressive movement.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, so at the time, it was considered like this progressive move forward to a better penal system, I guess, is like the main point that they're trying to go with. That's like, so like, it was considered like to be a more positive way, and is basically shifting convict labor away from private interests, although that's not happened, and shifting it towards like building roads, particularly constructing roads, and still some railroads, but they are mainly under the supervision of counties and towns instead of like under the state or like private interests. But what this kind of leads us to is actually the other more shadowy convict leasing, because So basically, what we've been talking about so far is the lighter side of convict leasing, and that is the state convict leasing with official contracts and kind of like at least every once in a while somebody would show up and be like, "Huh, what are y'all doing to the convicts down here?" Like occasionally. But in the case of county and more rural forms of that was not the case. So the way it normally worked is that these were kind of like shadowy things that were essentially entirely outside of government, at least state and federal government supervision, and were pretty much entirely like on the county. So like there's like not even a whole lot of information with it, but they mainly like um, worked in turpentine and lumber farms, which apparently are very terrible to work on. Not a lot of fun. But way this would happen is that so it's kind of similar to convict leasing, is people would be arrested for petty crimes, maybe even more petty than normal, and oftentimes probably not even often even more did not do it. Like definitely didn't do it. Sort of instances. So basically what would happen is you'd get accused of crime, you can be convicted oftentimes when these are usually all misdemeanor offenses, and you obviously for misdemeanor generally wouldn't go to jail, but you would be fined. You'd either get a fine and you'd have to pay your court costs, especially if you're convicted. And guess what? A lot of people did not have to pay for their fines. So they ended up. So basically, what would happen is a very loosely deputized justice of the peace would hold these hearings, and then people would essentially other people in the area would show up and just be like stand there and wait. And if someone got convicted and couldn't pay their fine, they would just pay for them. And so those people would end up having to work off their debt, either in like county or like city convict labor mines. So those were usually lumber and turpentine farms, and they were very not good. They were even worse. This was like I said, more shadowy in that there's like absolutely no oversight, and owners could essentially whatever they wanted. And usually what's even worse is that what you're saying is that most of the people got sentenced for like 5 years and get sent to like mines. In this case, they could be sentenced between 30 days and 1 year and get sent to these lumber mines to where they could possibly die and be worked like dogs essentially and beat for not doing anything because again, no supervision. Chain gangs essentially come out of this. So chain gangs at least do switch to being controlled by run for supposedly for public good. So they are, they're at least put on, convicts are put to like working, we're put to like working on mainly constructing roads and leveling railroads. But even with the chain gangs, so for people who don't know what chain gangs are, if you've ever seen like old movies or whatever, you ever see the guys like on the roadside or on railroads, and they're all chained together, hitting up, doing I've been working on the chain gang. Yeah, that thing. That's a chain gang.
Go watch Oh Brother Where Art Thou.
Yeah, solid movie, fun one. So yeah, that's what a chain gang is. They generally work building the roads. So pretty much all of the roads, especially particularly Atlanta, had probably some of the most advanced at the time. Pretty much all that was built by convict labor. Also with the chain gang, it becomes even more pronounced racially. So in Georgia, at least 95% of those on chain gangs were black. So the vast majority of on chain gangs building the roads were black people coerced into that labor. So they probably had some of the most advanced roads there. And so I have one little thing here. So here's some statistics on it. Okay, in 1904, not even 3% of the state's 57,000 miles of roads were surfaced with gravel, stone, sand, clay. By 1909, when all the convicts were placed on the road, 82,000 miles of road, 7.27% of which was surfaced, although only 5 miles were laid, and by 2 minutes macadam, the most modern road surface. 5 years later, however, the percentage of surfaced roads had at least doubled to 15.5%, estimate over 25%. By 1914, Georgia counties had between 200 and 300 miles of surfaced roads. So there was a significant increase of surfaced roads because directly attributable to chain gang labor. And again, so like the big thing with roads is that we talk about it being for public service, but we live in America, so we know that a lot of these roads are going to be built for business interests, because obviously it's going to be used to like transport goods, and something we talked about with the rail. They used it to transport these things, the coal and stuff that they extracted. So a very similar thing happens with the roads. So yeah, a lot of the roads I drove on growing up were probably built by convict labor. Not something fun to talk about.
I think it's interesting hearing that Atlanta had good roads at one point.
That is
like,
interesting.
When you think about Atlanta now, it's just like horrible roads and horrible traffic. So,
Nelson, you just did the most boomer comment in this entire.
I know, right?
Oh my god, they used to have good roads, not like the old days.
Yeah,
you know, back in my day,
Atlanta had the best roads. Now,
I do declare.
Ironically, now Atlanta is like all roads and highways, but which is great. Love it. I love having no public transportation to speak of. It's fun. But those are the main things I had on convict labor and chain gangs. So chain gangs will go on until essentially the 19th, when it is eventually outlawed, largely because of the writings of, well, this guy, Robert E. Burns. He was a white man who was, so obviously no one really cared until a white man got caught up into it and wrote a book about it. A lot of the people who did end up like kind of doing the exposés were either journalists or white men who were in the chain gang. And so Robert E. Burns is one of them. He was a New Yorker from Brooklyn who was in World War I. He south and got arrested. He claims that he was basically being a hobo at the time. He claims that a guy like had forced him to commit a robbery. I don't know if that's true or not, or if he's just saying that, but he says that, and he was put into a chain gang, and made his way up to Chicago. Started a big old business. It was called the Greater Chicago Magazine, I think, is what he started. And then they still extradited him back to Georgia and made him serve on the chain gang. He wrote this whole book about it, and he became really famous. That's why chain gangs were ended. He does talk a lot about it, so I mean, it's obvious. I didn't like go into like a lot of the beatings and stuff because I think that's just gratuitous and not really something that everyone needs to know. But yeah, I mean, so one of the things that they had trouble with was obviously, I think I already mentioned this, that convicts either like trying to slow down their pace of work or something like that, because that's one of the ways you resist. Like, I mean, especially like in the old days of enslavement, because like a lot of people would resist by just slowing down the work. So these things so chain gangs and convict lessees would resort to obviously beatings and torture, and especially like for things like escaping. He describes how when guys escaped, they had like with like whips and stuff, and yeah, it's not fun. He talks about like them being strapped down like on a and their bare buttocks getting hit with this thing until like they got infected. So that sort of stuff was pretty common. Accounts was not like entirely that was like something that wasn't like specific to the chain gang he was on. It was general use. So yeah, it was, I think Edward Baptiste, I think that's how you say his name. He has this whole thing called the pushing system, which talking about enslavement, and I think that's kind of still accurate. So the pushing system, basically what he calls the pushing system, is having people constantly just like beating you or like trying to pushing you to like constantly be raising your quota or being able to raise production. Something that still continues with the chain gang or convict leasing is that it's still constant beatings and that sort of stuff to make sure that production doesn't like cut off. And I think so that's the main thing here is that even is that all of the like a lot of the things that were most coercive forms of labor were still maintained in just a different way, and it was done with pretty much entire complicity and support of not only Southern industrialists, in a lot of ways Northern industrialists who at this time were still like because so a big point is that pretty much all like a lot of these mining companies were dependent on Northern capital. So I think one of the ones I talked I think it was the one with DeBarla Ben, that one of Alabama. I can't say his name right. But he was working with Northern capitalists who were some of the people that originally provided the startup money I think the blast furnace he built in Birmingham. So yeah, a lot of that sort of stuff where it's obviously, yeah, where we kind of have this image of it being all the evil South doing all this forced labor when really it's just like that kind of like obscures the fact that a lot of people had their hands in this and were making money off of it.
Ah, yes, when the Yankee Devil can make their money,
Yeah,
they
exactly.
gladly support this peculiar institution we have down here.
Yeah,
but I think
exactly.
I don't want to jump ahead, but the chain gang like kind of continued on. I remember even recently they were talking about it. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm gonna jump the gun or not, but like.
So Burns there at the end, but Burns's book he comes out in the 30s, and I think chain gangs formally get essentially ended in the 1930s. But again, I think it's like another case of kind of like how slavery was ended, where still have people in jails doing work, and I think we still have people who work on public roads. It's not as severe as it used to be, but yeah, it's still like I think
because I remember it. I remember it recently, and I looked because I was like, I remember hearing about it in the news. I looked it up, and Alabama had a resurgence of chain gangs like in the 90s. So like from like 95 to like 97, they started coming back, and I think that's when the media was like, "Hey, wait a minute, Alabama, you're being Alabama again." And so you're gonna have to cut that out. But I think like Alabama, Mississippi, like I think even Mississippi up until fairly recently was still technically using chain gangs. And then that jackass out in Arizona, Sheriff Papaya or whatever, he was talking about fucking he brought them back for a bit. Actual chain gangs. It's just like why can't we that jackass. It's like that fascist. Like why can't we just stop this? It's not good. But then like we talk about the now it's just like the whole prison industrial complex is you have people that are incarcerated that are still working either in either now call centers or they're working at like actual metal shops and stuff that are in the prisons that are making things for corporations, and private prisons, as we all know, have taken over, and they're still using convict labor. So it's just like it's one of those things that like when everyone talks about the asterisks in the 13th Amendment that like except for incarcerated people, this is like what everyone's like the progression of like the end of chattel slavery to like, oh, wink wink, you can still have slaves if they're incarcerated. And it's like that progression from convict leasing to prison labor today. It's just like this whole progression of it that like just never ended. It just never dies. It just remorphs and comes back like a fucking necromorph. It just never dies.
The convict lease is kind of the essential like original private prison, right? Because like it was literally just sending prisoners to work for private companies who took the entire responsibility of supposedly housing and quote unquote housing. There just like was not a whole lot of supervision. Some of the things that does end up happening is that occasionally, basically throughout the entire 40-year period of this, occasionally the state will be like, "Oh, you mean they're abusing people?" And then they'll send in a person to be like to look at it, and they'll be out of people, and then they would come back and be like, "All right, we're gonna make some slight reforms on the edges here and there. Maybe don't beat them just as bad," and then just like not actually paying any attention to what they're doing. So that's like a consistent theme. It's just like realizing that they know everything's fucked up, but they're not doing it.
Yeah. Kyle, were you gonna say something? You had your mic unmuted. I thought maybe you were gonna say something. I cut you off.
Yeah, I was just thinking like about when like the chain gang system was starting to be taken out. The first thing that I thought of, because I was brought up on Turner Classic Movies, was the movie Cool Hand Luke, which came out in 1965. And then I was thinking like, well, I'm pretty sure chain gangs didn't make it all the way into the 60s. Cool Hand Luke was supposed to take place in Florida in the 1950s. So I went to look at when Florida stopped using chain gangs, and they didn't stop until 1946 formally. So Florida being Florida again, outlasted everyone else.
Seems like what we have here is a failure to communicate.
You gotta have a weird, creepy, high voice to do that.
What we have here is a failure to communicate. Southern twang. Ugh.
Yeah, that's a part of Florida that you don't ever want to find.
The bad Florida man. Who's the man?
I've actually Florida a bit. My family. I have a lot of family in Florida, so I've been there a lot. And don't Palatka, Florida. Been there a lot. Don't intend to go back too much, but
Don't worry, there's not going to be a lot left after this week. You don't got to come back.
Okay.
Man.
That is pretty much all I had. It kind of went a little bit faster than I thought I was going to. Not sure if y'all had anything else you wanted me to talk about or add on. If you had any questions, we need to fill more time.
No, it's we're good. It's still kind of like, I know from my studies, which your grad school for history, like you hear about these things, and it's one of those. It's like something that like I said before, just never dies. It's just like always there. It's like chattel slavery. It's like chattel slavery ended. Then you have convict leasing, chain gangs, and like some of that stuff just straight up sounded like indentured servitude. It was like, oh, you can't pay your fine. Well, guess what? I'm random farmer guy. You're gonna come work for me. I'm random coal mine owner. You're gonna come work for me. And it's just, oh man, it's just one of those things. It's like, why the fuck will just never end?
Yeah, and it's like the worst part is that you're basically, except for either, like not being employed by a white person, or like another thing that black people, especially during slavery, would like would kind of do is they would just steal stuff from their landlord or their master, whatever. And they would steal from them, and that'd be kind of like part of their due. And like that's kind of like something they kept doing under sharecropping and tenant farming, and that as like a form of resistance or just form of survival would be stealing little bits from their landlord, and that would get them sent to prison. And it's like stuff that they had worked to pretty much produce all of, and they got sent to jail for that.
I think one of the ironic things is that, like, when I read about Hammer and Hoe, and we talked about in the Sharecroppers Union episode, is that like the sharecroppers couldn't leave because they couldn't like basically get their families and their stuff out until the roads were built. And then once the roads were built, they were like, bye. Get the fuck out of here.
And that's like the entire, that's also, it's a weird like tangle, because that's like the entire point of having the convict leasing was to prevent, it was basically a form of labor discipline to prevent black people from being able to leave their tenant farming situation or the sharecropping situation. Yeah. So there's like obviously all that's like directly connected.
Yeah.
So I guess it is an irony that the roads that got built from chain gangs and convict leasing were the roads that they took to get the hell out.
Yeah, it's just like,
and then
the Great Migration happens when they finish the roads. Guys, we can leave now. Let's get the fuck out of here.
Actually, we can talk. I can't talk about something real for a quick second, because I wrote an essay for Brooklyn Eviction Defense, which, by the way, y'all should check them out if you have not already.
We don't participate in Yankee publications around here.
I'm sorry. But I worked on a zine for that one. I kind of talked about the transition from Southern Tennessee to Northern Tennessee, basically because like they went from being tenant farmers to moving to mainly northern states and getting any better treatment. So they moved to like Harlem and still had to face like slumlords and stuff, and like very high prices, because obviously, so what happens when black people move to cities is that they are pretty much funneled into only one or two neighborhoods, segregation and white flight. So like in the case of Harlem, a lot of black people ended up started moving to Harlem, and that like led a lot of the European immigrants that had originally taken up place in Harlem. They started moving out towards the other suburbs or to the other boroughs, flight. And then what ends up happening is that everything's more expensive when you're a black person, and everything's a lot more expensive when you're poor. So it's called a black tax. The farmers, the landlords in Harlem began to raise prices to exorbitant levels. Tenants. And what they end up doing is like Harlem had started out as kind of like fancy pants neighborhood, with like high end buildings that were originally built for bigger families. So what they ended up doing was subdividing all those bigger apartments, like very small apartments, and putting people in there and like charging them super high prices for things like rat infested tenement buildings and that sort of stuff. I mean, some of it was better than some of the tenement housing in like the Lower East Side, but it's still pretty bad. And yeah, so basically all the black people are forced to like live in Harlem, and in many ways now it's like, since then obviously black people have been like forced out of like Manhattan areas in a lot of ways, either through, so there's actually a really good documentary called what is it called? Here somewhere. whatever. It was about the squatters movement. Well, some of the squatters movements in the 70s and 80s. Oh, Break and Enter. It's a really good documentary about some of the squatter movement in the 70s, in 60s and 70s in New York City. About basically people just moving into buildings and taking them over and being like, we're going to live here as a cooperative, and it's super cool. But yeah, so it's a long process, and basically, I guess the point I'm mainly getting at is the whole thing throughout this. One of the kind of themes throughout this, the North ain't that much different, at least in terms of like Northern industrialists are very much willing to participate in some of the most coercive labor. Like there's a book called No God But Gain, which is about how even after that slavery and before that, like especially in Cuba, it basically revolves around Cuba and how like U.S. diplomats use Cuba as a place to like maintain slavery. Like a lot of old Confederate plantation owners moved to Cuba, and a lot of even like U.S. merchants still like operated Cuba, got like the sugar they needed from Cuba. Yeah, not all that sort of stuff.
We did a whole episode on the Confederados, which were Confederate plantation owners and Confederate officers that moved to Brazil to try to set up like plantations and whatnot, but it just failed epically because they're idiots.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a theme there as well. That's the main idiots. And oh yeah, basically the big theme is that like, particularly the North, is that moving to northern cities did not necessarily. I mean, like some ways, in that it was like less, I guess, less overt racism. But I mean, as I always point out, is like the system of segregation. We often describe it as, in the North we call it, in the South it's called de jure, and the North it's like de facto or whatever. Is that there's not really that much of a difference, because the segregation in the North was still codified and enforced by state power. Like it wasn't like something informal that everyone just decided on. It had to be enforced by state power, and I think that's an interesting point to make.
One day we'll do an episode on the Boston busing riot, just because I hate Boston.
Yeah, dude, everyone hates Boston. Everyone. I mean, obviously I'm in New York, so like it's probably a little bit biased. But I've never heard anyone be like, "Yeah, Boston's a great place to go visit. Go hang out."
It's like one of those top 5 things no one ever says. It's like, oh, I love Boston.
Exactly.
Oh man. Alex, thanks so much for doing this. Kai, Mark, y'all have anything y'all wanna say? You have any questions? Any final comments about how the United States sucks?
Listen to good program. Brain empty.
Yeah,
I think I can smell my dad cooking pork chops as well. This is like staying our parents' house. There's no thoughts. I'm sorry. This is a very good episode, but nothing is happening.
I'm glad it turned out pretty good. So I was a little nervous and felt I wish I had a little personal, some personal stuff happened recently that kind of just distracted me, but I was able to get a little something together for the end.
Hell yeah. No, we appreciate it, man. Hell yeah. Mark, do you have anything you want to add being in Georgia? Did you own one of those mines? Does it feel
like Siberia in Rome?
Yeah, is it
yeah, Georgia? Well, I was born in Cartersville. So I know exactly. It's just you'll hear older people in Cartersville talk about how great the railroad is all the time, and all the little museums, all the little plaques talking about, oh, look at our, like, yeah. And I'm not quite sure the extent of like the modern politics around it in Cartersville now, but it's just, you can still tell that there's a very heavy presence there, and just in Northwest Georgia in general, but it's still right in the middle of everything. It's right in between Rome and like Marietta and Kennesaw. Okay. And so if someone's trying to get back and forth, you have to go through Cartersville. And it's like still the hub of everything. And everyone there is still poorer than everyone in the surrounding region. And rent's really high, and all the jobs there. I think someone told me the closer you get to Rome, the lower your wages get. And so it still echoes. Like, it's not really, not to the extent, of course, but it's still there.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like Macon. Macon is like, Macon's a little bit of a wasteland. I don't know. I used to take the Greyhound between, and one of the stops is always in Macon. That's the only time I've ever really been there. It's like the several times, like a bunch of times I went through there, and it's not, they're not having fun in Macon right now, especially. But it's Macon's like also the one bit of like civilization, I guess, quote unquote civilization between pretty much like you basically go through middle of like pretty much nothing. I mean, there's like towns and stuff like East Dublin or whatever. It's one of the towns, and then you get to Macon, and then you kind of like start hitting like cities and stuff. But up until there, it's like all very cool.
Yeah, when you're headed to Savannah and you finally see sign for Macon, you're like, oh, thank God.
Yeah.
Macon creeps me out. I played a show there one night and I was just like, this place just creeps me the fuck out. I don't know why. I just felt really uneasy in Macon. When I got to Savannah, I was like, oh, yeah, I'm in Savannah.
That's the difference. You can start in South Florida and at the end of the day, you'll still be in Florida if you keep driving north. You don't get to change anything. It's all just the same all the way through.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, our accents just changed a little bit. It's pretty much the same too.
Yes.
No matter what anyone says, it's still the same.
Alex, before I do the outro, where can people find you and find your work and get up with you to ask you angry questions and to tell you everything you got wrong about this episode?
Yeah, if you want to come yell at me, I run Not Southern Marxist on Instagram, Southern Marxist on Twitter. I'm an editor at Midwestern Marx, so I have some writing up there. We should have a journal coming out by the end of this year, and I have an essay. Really, I'm very excited about because I spent a lot of time on it. Ended up being 30 pages, so it's a long one. But it's about it's called Castro Lose Negroes, which sorry for using that. It's about the title is a headline quote. So yeah, I'm not like just it's a quote from a headline from the Citizens Council, which was like basically a pro-segregation paper. In the South, and basically what I talk about is how Dare was used by segregationists to justify segregation, obviously branding which anybody who opposed segregation as like a red communist, and how that was like linked to the Cuban Revolution in 1959. How segregationists try to use the Cuban Revolution and like the very long so like Gerald Horne has a book talking about the long history between like racial tension, like sort of like the crossover and racial relations between Cuba and the U.S. And that's kind of so that'll be in our next upcoming journal, which is coming out this year. Yeah, there's a place to reach me.
Funny enough, I'm reading that book, this nonviolent stuff will get you killed. And there's in it they talk about this joke where it's like it's a running joke amongst like black people in the South at the time, and they said that they would always blame like the civil rights movement on communists or whatever, but like when like communists would show up, black people would be like, oh, thank God you're here, wink wink, because now they can focus on you and we can get back to doing like our actual civil rights stuff. It was like I was like I think I chuckled out loud when I got to that point. This shit was funny. But
I remember that joke. It was a good one.
All right, y'all. Dixieland, the proletariat, believe the South will rise again, but this time for the right reasons, those being worker-owned means of production, decolonization, and self-determination for all oppressed peoples. Make sure to click on our link tree in the show notes to find all of our social media. We are coming to you from the birthplace of the civil rights movement, Montgomery, Alabama, as well as sweet Georgia and jolly old England. Well, actually, Florida. Yes.
We're not coming.
The Sunshine State. The Sunshine State. That means I have to add another land acknowledgement. We'd also like to recognize that we are recording on occupied land that rightfully belongs to the Muskogee Nation, the Cherokee Nation, and now the Seminole Nation. Real quick, y'all, before we go, I do have a side note. There is his name is Kastellio Vaughn. He is imprisoned at Stanton Prison in Elmore County. If you guys have seen this on social media, I believe I'm going to link an article from AL.com about the whole story and a link to his GoFundMe. Basically, he had he was incarcerated, had medical procedures done, and was basically abandoned by the Alabama Department of Corrections. And somebody had snuck pictures of him and sent it to his family. And when I tell you, he went from, in like the span of a few months, looking like a healthy individual to something that you would see in a Holocaust documentary. I'm not lying. It's absolutely disgusting what the Alabama Department of Corrections is doing to this man. And there's a link in the article that I'm going to post about his GoFundMe and his story. I believe that Alabama prisoners are on strike work stoppages and everything because of what's happening to this man. It is absolutely disgusting. Alabama's prisons are literally the worst in the nation. So if y'all will please share that story and donate to his GoFundMe, and I also post a link about the thread on Twitter if people want to retweet that, because what's happening to him is disgusting. And the last update I saw was that he's still in bad shape. They haven't really tried to fix anything. So this man is probably going to die because he's being forgotten and neglected by the Alabama Department of Corrections on something like a non-violent. I know it doesn't even matter, but on top of all that, those salt in the wound, it's going back to what we talk about, petty stuff that people get arrested for. It's like literally something petty that he was arrested for, and now he's probably going to die in prison. So I'm going to link that in the show notes so people to please check out and donate. But Alex, again, thank you so much for coming on. Mark, you want to do your thing?
If the shoe fits, wear it.